The studio lights gleamed over the packed audience at the Inquirer, MSNBC's flagship political show. The energy inside Rockefeller Plaza was palpable, like the air before a storm. People whispered, some skeptical, others curious. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his tie, settling into his chair. He had built a career tearing through guests with razor-sharp questioning, exposing contradictions under live television's unforgiving glare. But tonight was different. He exhaled, smirking at the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest tonight is someone I never thought I'd see in this chair. The crowd murmured. There are people who thrive in open debate, he continued, voice smooth. And there are those who, well, let's just say they choose silence. A pause, a knowing smile. And yet here she is. The anticipation spiked. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan turned toward the entrance. Please welcome, former First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump. The room stilled. Then applause. Scattered, hesitant. Some clapped out of politeness. Others sat rigid, arms crossed. And then, she stepped out. Melania Trump moved with an effortless grace, a vision in an ivory-white suit that contrasted starkly against the deep blue set. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to scrutiny. If she felt the weight of the moment, she didn't show it. Ethan extended a hand. Mrs. Trump. She accepted it. Firm, brief. Thank you for having me. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from him. Please, have a seat. She lowered herself elegantly, legs crossed, posture impeccable. Her expression? Unreadable. Ethan leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping the desk. I have to say, Mrs. Trump, this is unexpected. Melania tilted her head slightly. Why? He smirked. You're not exactly known for giving interviews. I speak when I have something to say. A sharp response. Not defensive, not aggressive, just firm. Ethan chuckled. Fair enough. He folded his hands. Let's start simple. How's life been since leaving the White House? Peaceful, she replied smoothly. I focus on my family, my projects, and helping children through my initiatives. Ethan nodded slowly. Interesting, he mused. Because some might say you spent most of your time in the White House doing the same thing, staying quiet. The audience stirred. The first real moment of the night. Melania remained still, unbothered. Then, I believe, she said, that actions speak louder than words. Ethan arched an eyebrow. That's a polished answer. He leaned in. But let's be real, Mrs. Trump. Some argue that when you're in a position of influence, silence is a statement. Melania met his gaze, unwavering. It is easy to talk, she said. Harder to make a real difference. A ripple went through the crowd. Ethan's jaw tensed slightly. He hadn't expected her to handle that so smoothly. He adjusted in his seat, recalculating. And yet, history remembers those who spoke up, not those who stayed silent. Melania tilted her head. And do you believe history always tells the truth? A murmur swept through the audience. Ethan hesitated. Just for a second. Melania's lips curled into the faintest smile. Ethan exhaled, regaining his footing. All right, he said, fingers drumming against the desk. Let's not dance around it. There are questions you've avoided for years. He leaned forward, voice dropping slightly. Let's set the record straight. The room tensed. Melania didn't blink. Ethan's smirk sharpened. Let's talk about your husband. The air in the studio turned electric. And for the first time that night, Melania's expression flickered. Not with surprise, not with discomfort, but something far more dangerous. Amusement. The studio remained silent, the weight of Ethan's last words still hanging in the air. Melania sat motionless, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick, pressing against every breath, every movement. Ethan leaned forward, voice smooth but edged with challenge. You were the closest person to Donald Trump. You saw everything firsthand. Yet, when the country was in turmoil, when people needed to hear from you, you stayed silent. A pause, a slight tilt of his head. Why? The audience held their breath. Melania remained still for a moment longer, then spoke, her voice calm. Strength is not measured by how loudly you speak, Mr. Caldwell. Sometimes, it is measured by what you choose to rise above. A murmur swept through the room. Ethan's lips pressed together briefly. That's a poetic answer, he said. But let's be honest, some see silence as complicity. When your husband made statements that many felt divided the country, your silence was seen as approval. Do you disagree? Melania tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. Division has always existed, long before my husband. People like you. She paused just slightly, letting the words sink in. Need someone to blame. The audience stirred. Some nodded. Others whispered. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his pen tapping lightly against the desk. So, you're saying you had no responsibility to speak out? I had a responsibility to act, Melania corrected. Not to entertain headlines. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. So, you're saying words don't matter? I'm saying empty words don't, she countered. The crowd murmured again. The energy in the room shifted, subtle, but noticeable. Ethan adjusted his tie, his smirk returning. All right, he said. Then let's stop speaking in philosophies. Let's get real. His voice lowered just slightly, just enough to feel like a direct challenge. Do you agree with everything your husband has said and done? A flicker of something unreadable passed through Melania's gaze. She let the silence stretch, drawing everyone in. Then, she smiled. I think, she said slowly, that's exactly what you want, isn't it? Ethan's smirk faltered, just for a second. You want a headline, she continued. A soundbite. Something to twist and spin. A slight pause. But I won't give you that. The audience stirred again. Ethan inhaled sharply, recalculating. Melania leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Mr. Caldwell, do you agree with everything your network has said? The air inside the studio shifted instantly. The audience gasped. Ethan blinked. Melania held his gaze, unwavering. Or do you choose when to speak and when to stay silent? For the first time, Ethan hesitated. The room buzzed with energy, some laughing, others whispering, a few even clapping. Ethan forced a chuckle, straightening his tie. Touché. Melania sat back, unbothered. We all pick our battles, Mr. Caldwell. Even you. Ethan exhaled, glancing at his notes. He had walked into this conversation expecting control, but somehow, she had taken it. Not with force, not with anger, but with something far more powerful. Composure. Ethan met her gaze again, eyes sharp. All right, Mrs. Trump, he said, voice steady. Let's raise the stakes. A pause. A shift. Let's talk about your marriage. The room fell into complete silence. And for the first time, something flickered in Melania's expression. Not surprise, not fear, but something far more dangerous. A warning. The studio felt impossibly still. The weight of Ethan's question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Melania Trump remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that warned this conversation had just crossed a line. Ethan leaned forward, voice controlled. People have speculated for years, he said. They've analyzed every glance, every moment of distance between you and your husband. And they've wondered. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Are you happy in your marriage, Mrs. Trump? A hush fell over the room. Melania tilted her head slightly, then smiled. Happiness is subjective, Mr. Caldwell. Some find it in approval, others in power, and some in knowing who they are, no matter what the world says. A murmur rippled through the audience. Ethan's smirk twitched. That's an elegant deflection, he noted. But let's not dance around it. You've been married to Donald Trump for over 20 years. And yet, the world still wonders why. Melania remained poised. Why do you wonder? Ethan exhaled a quiet laugh. Because people see the headlines, the controversies, and they wonder how a woman like you, poised, intelligent, stays in a marriage that many assume is built on convenience. The room tensed. Even those expecting controversy were caught off guard by his boldness. Melania didn't react. Convenience, she echoed, as if testing the word. Ethan spread his hands. Is your marriage built on love or obligation? Silence. Then, Melania leaned in slightly, her voice steady. People who do not understand something often make assumptions about it, she said. Because it is easier than admitting they simply do not know. Ethan's smirk faded just slightly. Then tell them. Tell us. What is the truth? Melania's gaze held his. The truth is, I know the life I chose, and I do not need to explain it to anyone. The audience stirred. Some clapped. Others whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not an answer. Melania's expression didn't change. It is my answer. Ethan exhaled through his nose. He wasn't done. You stood beside a man accused of many things. And yet, you never walked away. Never spoke against him. Some would say that makes you complicit. Melania's voice was unwavering. People mistake loyalty for weakness. But loyalty, true loyalty, is a choice. And it is not one I make lightly. A ripple went through the crowd. Ethan adjusted in his seat, recalibrating. Then he took a breath and said, "Let's stop avoiding the real question, Mrs. Trump." The air inside the studio thickened. "Do you regret marrying Donald Trump?" A collective gasp. Melania's expression didn't waver. Then she smiled. "Regret is for those who do not take responsibility for their choices," she said. "I know who I married. I know the life I chose. And I stand by it. Not because it is easy, but because it is mine." The audience erupted. Ethan opened his mouth, but hesitated. Melania's gaze swept the room. "We live in a world where it is easy to judge from the sidelines. But you cannot understand someone's life unless you have lived it." A pause. "And I do not owe anyone an explanation for mine." The applause swelled. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell looked unsure. The energy in the studio had shifted. The audience, once murmuring in speculation, now sat transfixed. Ethan Caldwell, for the first time that night, hesitated. His fingers curled against the edge of his desk, his polished confidence flickering just slightly. Melania Trump, on the other hand, remained composed, unshaken. She had just dismantled his most pointed question with a single sentence. And she knew it. Ethan inhaled slowly, recalibrating. "All right," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper now. "You stand by your choices. Your marriage. Your silence. But here's the thing, Mrs. Trump, silence is not always neutrality." He let the words settle, then leaned in. "Some would say that by not speaking out against the more divisive things your husband has said, you weren't just neutral. You were complicit." A shift rippled through the audience. Some nodded. Others stiffened in anticipation. Melania studied him, then exhaled softly. "It is easy to blame one person," she said. "Easier than admitting the world is more complicated than a headline." Ethan's smirk returned, though it was thinner now. "That's an interesting way to avoid the question." "I did not avoid it," she countered. "I answered it. You just don't like my answer." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Ethan's grip on his pen tightened. He exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat. "Let's take an example," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Charlottesville." A collective inhale swept through the audience. Ethan didn't blink. "After that incident, your husband said there were very fine people on both sides." That statement alone set off a firestorm. And you, his wife, a woman with immense influence, said nothing. Why? For the first time, the room felt genuinely tense. Melania's expression remained unreadable, but she waited before responding, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment heavier. Then she spoke. "I am not my husband," she said. Ethan's brow twitched. "I am his wife," she continued, voice unwavering. "But I do not control his words, just as he does not control mine." "But you had a platform," Ethan pressed. "A responsibility." Melania met his gaze. "And I used it in my own way." Ethan leaned back slightly, arms crossing. "By saying nothing? By choosing when to speak." The audience murmured. Ethan exhaled sharply, adjusting his tie. "All right," he said, shifting tactics. "Let's talk about your own words then." He lifted a page from his notes, glancing at it briefly before looking back at her. "You launched an initiative as First Lady. Be Best. A campaign focused on kindness, particularly on social media. Yet, your husband was one of the most controversial figures on social media. Many called him a cyberbully, his critics, his insults. And still, you never called him out. How do you justify that contradiction?" A wave of hushed conversation rippled through the audience. Melania's lips pressed together briefly. Then, she tilted her head. "You assume that one person's actions define an entire movement," she said. "That kindness only matters if it is universal. But real kindness is not about perfection. It is about choosing, every day, to be better than we were before." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "So you're saying your campaign didn't apply to him?" "I am saying it applied to everyone," she answered smoothly. "Even you, Mr. Caldwell?" The audience erupted. Laughter. Gasps. A few scattered cheers. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Melania smiled. "You use words as weapons," she continued, voice as calm as ever. "And yet, you expect others to remain defenseless. That is not how the world works." Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening. He was losing control of the conversation. He needed to regain it. His voice lowered. "You say you're not responsible for your husband's words. That you've used your platform in your own way. But tell me, Mrs. Trump," he locked eyes with her. "What do you stand for?" Melania didn't blink. "I stand for dignity," she said. A pause. I stand for restraint, and for knowing that sometimes the loudest voice in the room is not the strongest. The studio fell silent. Ethan studied her, his pen resting motionless in his fingers. He had expected her to stumble, to waver, to give him something, anything, he could use to twist the narrative. But instead, she had done what no one expected. She had turned his words against him. For the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell looked like a man who was no longer in control. The air inside the studio was electric. The audience, once murmuring in anticipation, now sat in stunned silence. Ethan Caldwell, a man known for his ability to control a conversation, to dictate its flow, now found himself on unsteady ground. Melania Trump, seated across from him, remained poised, composed, unshaken. Ethan exhaled slowly, adjusting his posture. "Well," he said, forcing a tight smile, "you certainly have a way with words, Mrs. Trump." Melania gave a small, polite nod. "I speak only when necessary." Ethan chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. "Then let's not waste words," he said, his voice firm. "Here's what people really want to know." He let the moment stretch, allowing the tension to thicken. "Then, do you believe your husband should be president again?" A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. For a moment, Melania didn't respond. The pause was deliberate, measured. Then she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "I believe the American people will decide what is best for their country," she said. Ethan's brow lifted. "That's a very diplomatic answer." "It is an honest one," she replied. "But do you support him?" Melania's expression didn't change. "I support my husband," she said, "as a wife. As I always have. But the presidency belongs to the people, not to me." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "So you're saying you have no opinion?" "I am saying my opinion does not decide elections," she said smoothly. The audience buzzed. Ethan's fingers tapped against the desk, his frustration just barely visible beneath his controlled demeanor. "All right," he said, his voice lowering. "Then tell me this. If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still have stepped into this life? Into his life?" A murmur swept through the room. Melania's gaze held his. And for the first time all night, something in her expression shifted. Not uncertainty. Not hesitation. Certainty. "I do not live in the past, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "And I do not entertain what-ifs. But surely, there have been regrets." Melania's lips pressed together slightly, as if considering his words. Then, she shook her head. "Regret is for those who wish to rewrite history," she said. "I do not wish to rewrite mine." Ethan opened his mouth, but she wasn't finished. "You see, Mr. Caldwell," she continued, her voice steady, "people think strength is in volume, in shouting the loudest, in proving a point. But real strength," she let her words settle, "is knowing when you have nothing to prove." The room fell silent. Ethan's jaw tensed. He had spent the entire interview trying to back her into a corner, to crack the mystery that was Melania Trump. But he had failed, and he knew it. He exhaled, offering a small, reluctant nod. "I have to admit," he said, "you've handled yourself better than most expected." Melania gave him a polite smile. "Expectations are not my concern." A beat. Then, Ethan glanced toward the camera, regaining his composure. "Well, Mrs. Trump, I think we've covered just about everything." He straightened. "Any final words for the American people?" Melania turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the audience. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured. "If you let others decide what you believe, then you are not thinking at all," she said. And with that, she sat back. The studio erupted, some clapping, some whispering, some simply sitting in stunned silence. Ethan forced a smile, nodding toward the cameras. "That was Melania Trump," he said. "We'll be right back." The red light on the camera flickered off. The interview was over. But the conversation was just beginning.